Still have people filtering in. We'll wait one more minute to get going. Okay, looks good. A lot of people have joined the webinar. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending upon what time zone that you're in. My name is Jeff Stanton, and I am one of the program directors in the Pathways to Enable Open Source Ecosystems program, what we call POES. We are going to spend less than 20 minutes, I hope, doing a quick overview of the program, and then we'll leave lots of time for a Q&A. We will be using the Q&A system that's built into Zoom rather than chat or hand raising, and so more on that when we get to it. I see there's already one question, and it says, will the webinar chat be open during this meeting? And Hamad is typing an answer. I think the answer is no, but we'll see what, yeah, so Hamad affirms to make sure to use the Q&A system when we get to that point. So let's just do a little tiny bit of orientation. And you all know NSF. Congress established NSF in 1950 to promote science progress for economic benefits, national security, global leadership. And the agency's current priorities are to strengthen established NSF programs by investing in fundamental research and to enhance and broaden participation in science and technology, particularly among those not currently participating in the STEM enterprise, and to accelerate technology development and innovation. And that is where the new TIP Directorate comes in. Let's see. I got to try to advance the slide. I don't know what my problem is here. Hold on. There we go. So in March of 2022, NSF launched the new Directorate for Technology Innovation and Partnerships. That was NSF's first new directorate in more than 30 years. TIP consolidates a number of translation activities that the foundation has invested in for many years prior to TIP. And so the TIP Directorate's mission is to maximize NSF's impact by harnessing talent to advance emerging technologies and to address, key societal and economic challenges. Accelerating the translation of research results is really a core activity of the TIP Directorate. So we're trying to cultivate innovation systems throughout the country for use-inspired research. We're trying to enhance the translation of emerging technologies to the market and to create partnerships that help to bring researchers and practitioners together. Now, the POES program really focuses on those first two goals that I mentioned. You can see the mission statement of the POES program here. It was conceived as a kind of translation mechanism and also an innovation mechanism. So typical strategies for product commercialization, such as those in the small business programs, focus on helping a product reach profitability. But POES focuses on creating self-sustaining ecosystems of developers and users around an open source project. So a different mechanism for innovation and translation. And keep in mind that POES is not limited to software. Among the 40 or so projects that we funded so far, several of them focus on hardware, several focus on data, several focus on educational resources, and there are a number of other things in there as well. that are not software as such. The creators of the POSE program recognize that the usual methods that are typical for open source projects, for example, distributed development, transparency of source code or design, free use and reuse and adaptation of a product, that these techniques work best when there's a collaboration that goes on between developers of the intellectual content of the project and the end users of the project. It's this ongoing dialogue between these two groups, and indeed, sort of membership crossing the boundaries between these two groups, that really makes the open source ecosystem work. So in the research literature on open source, the whole setup is often referred to as an open source ecosystem. And the goal of the POSE program is to catalyze the development of healthy open source ecosystems around a product. So you see that idea shown here. On the left, there's an open source project. Maybe it was designed originally by a scientist or someone else. Maybe it already has a user, and it might have more than one. And then the POSE program is funding the effort to turn that product into a complete ecosystem. And that ecosystem has, the product itself, of course. It may hopefully grow the number of external users. It will hopefully also create a robust community of developers or contributors with onboarding mechanisms that help to ease the process of bringing in new contributors. Hopefully it's got some comprehensive user support, so it's a product that's easy to use and adopt. And it's got the kind of infrastructure for continuous integration and security and privacy that make it possible to actually use the product safely and modify it as innovations are imagined. All right, so in the most essential terms, what POSE funding is used for is to scope and create a managing organization that can address those functions that are shown in the middle here. And our experience and the research as well seem to point to the list of functions that you see here as the minimal set that's needed for a healthy and long-lasting open source ecosystem. Administrative, legal, governance. Governance is very important. And user discovery, how do you find more users and reach out to them? Content development, that could be documentation, case studies, and so forth. So some of these functions usually raise the question of whether POSE supports developers. And so the answer is yes, the POSE program can support certain kinds of developer activity, such as the creation of documentation, demonstrations, tools that are necessary for bringing on new developers, and also certain elements of product infrastructure needed to create a successful ecosystem. And an example of that would be tools for testing prior to release and methods for ensuring security and privacy of any sensitive data that the product manages. Now, in this context, what POSE is not designed to fund is the development of new features and new capabilities of the core product. So I think of these as kind of the core development activities, and those are expected to be performed by the distributed network of developers that's cultivated by the managing organization. And most importantly, this distributed network of developers needs to be evergreen over time, right? New developers are joining and learning from current developers, and then some people decide to phase out of the group of developers. So now let's get into just some of the nitty-gritty details that you would need to know if you wanted to have put together an application to the POSE program. POSE program actually has two phases, and you see them represented at the top here. So in phase one, you might have an artifact that's already been made public. It could be a piece of software or something else, but there's really no ecosystem that surrounds that. It really is just maybe the core team working on a project that shows some promise. And the idea behind a phase one project is to discover the ecosystem. In other words, to scope out, find out what the composition is of the potential user community. And likewise, are there developers who could be brought on board to help with this project? And so you're trying to establish why an open source ecosystem is the right approach. That's a phase one scoping project. And that's really something that could bring an artifact to the point of knowing what it's going to take to put together a managing organization. And that's the function of phase two. Phase two takes a more well-informed scenario where the product exists, something is known about the user base, something is known about the potential developers, and then really creating the managing organization, getting to the point where there's a self-sustaining open source ecosystem. And of course, there's a little bit of overlap between those two. The boundary between phase one and phase two is not always rigid. And it's also important to realize that you don't have to apply for a phase one award first in order to be eligible for a phase two award. So some teams come to the POSE program with a relatively deep base of knowledge about who their users and developers are or will be, and they opt to go right for a phase two award without having done phase one first. Phase one awards have a 12-month duration and up to $300,000 as the limit on the award size, and a relatively small project description. So really about half the size of a normal NSF project description. And one important aspect of both phase one and phase two awards is to have some letters of collaboration, ideally from users and developers and others who will be supportive of the development and impact of the ecosystem that you have in mind. So phase two, the larger award, it's a full-size project description, so 15 pages like most NSF applications. Up to 24 months of duration, so a 2-year award, and up to $1.5 million. And the goal is that by the end of phase two award, there's a sustainable open source ecosystem that's ready to launch into existence and be something that will continue under its own steam. So a couple other things to know about the application process. Every proposal needs to have a security plan, and this plan has to describe the mechanisms to ensure the quality of code and data, security and access control mechanisms, particularly if there's any sensitive data involved, protection of the software supply chain or whatever supply chain is relevant, and ethical use of sensitive data, which if it involves data about living human beings may include needing to get IRB approval for the project. So a couple points about eligibility. We, of course, welcome proposals from institutions of higher education, but also from nonprofits and for-profits as well. So some small businesses that have a open source project in mind or as part of their portfolio can apply for a POSE award. And also US state and local governments are welcome to apply. So the nonprofit or for-profit proposing organizations have to be US based and US owned and controlled. And there's a lot of details in the solicitation about how that's defined. And you should definitely check those out to make sure that your nonprofit is ready to be a proposer. Another note is that POSE proposals can be collaborative. In fact, they're probably best if they are collaborative, but a single lead organization needs to submit the proposal and then use sub-award budgets to involve the other organizations. I've got a note there about projects that may not be a good fit for the POSE program. So if there's not a distributed ongoing development effort of a product that already exists, is already made public, it may not be a good fit for the POSE program. So some proposers have floated ideas for things that aren't built yet, and that's not where the POSE program is putting its emphasis. So a note on who can serve as a principal investigator, typical ideas for institutions of higher education, usually faculty members. And then for nonprofits and for-profit organizations, the PI has to be an employee who's normally resident in the US. So there's much more detail in the solicitation about these definitions, and I encourage you to take a look, particularly if you're a nonprofit or for-profit proposer. So there are some budget details that are slightly unusual for an NSF award. One is that there's no equipment permitted for phase one POSE awards. Those are meant to be mainly focused on scoping rather than developing the managing organization. And so it's been deemed that equipment doesn't make sense in that context, as it's mainly an opportunity to explore the composition of the potential communities that are involved in the open source ecosystem. Like the small business programs at NSF, we request background material price quotes for all materials, supplies, and travel requests. So considerably more detail than what would normally be expected for a research grant. And again, these pieces of information are in the solicitation, so I encourage you to take a look at that. There is a possibility of international collaboration, but as you probably know, NSF does not generally support international actors or activities. So travel to international conferences is a possibility, but generally not funding of international organizations. So there are detailed instructions in the solicitation about how to apply. And as we swing into the spring and summer, I'm going to run some office hours for applicants to ask any questions that you might have about the application process. And if you're from a nonprofit or for-profit organization, that might be a great opportunity to understand some of the details that will be involved, particularly if you're a first-time NSF proposer. The current deadline that's shown on the solicitation is September 5. There's no chance that that will move any earlier, so you can count on that. And all of the proposals are going to be reviewed by merit review panelists. We assemble panels of experts. We have topical experts, we have open source experts, and we have organizational experts that usually sit on these panels to look at the proposals from all of those different dimensions. And it generally takes 6 months or even slightly a little bit longer than that for us to be able to review all of those proposals that come in. And that is pretty much the end of things I wanted to say. I'm very proud that I came in about 3 minutes under my goal of 20 minutes. And that leaves lots of time for questions to come in. And as you think of your questions, I can see there's some already queued up. I want you to keep in mind that this is our full group of program officers who are involved in the POSE program, and you can see that they come from all over the foundation, lots and lots of different topical areas that are represented here. There is an email address that's easy to remember, pose@nsf.gov. And if you send a message there, I will probably answer it within a day or two. And happy to get back to you and address any questions that you might have about the program or the application process. So with that, I'm going to stop the screen share. And we're going to turn to Q&A. And let's see what we got. I'm going to read these questions because they won't always be visible to people afterwards. So first question, will the webinar recording be available? And Hamad has already answered that one. Yes, we are going to make the recording of this webinar available on the POSE website. So the next question, does the open source project have to pre-exist the application in order to get POSE funding? And Trish has addressed that. Thank you, Trisha. There must be a product already in existence with an established user base. Next question. So could POSE support the creation of a nonprofit to establish an ongoing legal entity to receive financial support and retain assets? to benefit an open source activity. And Trish mentions that that does not sound like Pose, and I would refine that to say that it's often the case that Pose projects do establish a nonprofit in the course of a phase 2 award. And that's all in service of trying to create a healthy ecosystem. So a lot of the devil is in the details there. All right, so next question. To what extent do we need to have an established user base, enough to identify who the users are and how they would benefit from the product? Or do we need to have an active community? So the beautiful thing about a phase 1 award is that it gives you an opportunity to more deeply scope and understand what your user community and your developer communities would look like. But as Trish mentions, we want to, or I shouldn't say we, but merit review panelists want to see that there is potential for your project to grow and have a robust user base after some period of time. And so they will be judging your proposal based on your ability to make that argument that there is the potential out there for a good base of users and that this can be an impactful project. So up to the next question is about what does a letter of collaboration look like and how many would be compelling? So the solicitation, as Trish mentions, asks for 3 to 5 letters. I definitely recommend finding all 5. And I think one of the key things that merit reviewers look for is that there's an attestation in the letter that really shows how the person writing the letter is connected to the project. So there should be some authenticity there. Merit reviewers, I've seen them react poorly to what looks like a boilerplate that was just signed, and it looks the same across multiple letters. So that's probably not a good idea. And so your 3 to 5, hopefully 5 letters should come from prospective or current users who can essentially give weight to your arguments that this is a product or a project that has some potential positive societal impact. Next question. So regarding open source licenses, are non-commercial use licenses acceptable in some cases? And Peter has mentioned that the license type should be appropriate. We don't dictate what type of license to use. There's lots and lots of discussions out there and in the literature about what types of licenses are appropriate for different kinds of projects. And we would expect a proposal to contain, clear justification about the license you have chosen. And there have been proposals that have come in for phase 1 where that matter of licensing hasn't yet been settled, but there has to be some clear sense that the proposers are cognizant of the issues and ready to make the product available as open source if it is not already out there. Next question, can a commercial product that becomes an open source project run by a small business, can that become a candidate for Pose funding? And Trish has very succinctly answered yes. And so I won't even add anything to that one. Next question. So if we want to create open source documentation for an existing software platform to expand community and have outside developers contribute, would that fit in phase 2? Trish responds that it sounds like it could be part of the activities of a phase 2 proposal, and you would probably do other things as well during phase 2, but what you have mentioned there sounds like a very promising activity to include in a phase 2 award. Next question, could Pose support the development and enhancement of an already existing open source platform? And so this is the fine line that I mentioned before between core product development and those associated developer activities that make it easier to onboard new developers or for users to adopt the product safely and in a streamlined way. So we encourage having developers who are knowledgeable about the product involved in making it easier to use and easier for new developers to come on board. and also for making the product more secure. But anything that looks like a feature, a new capability, and innovation, those are considered core development activities. And in general, merit reviewers are going to look at those and not be optimistic that those would be allowable in the project. So a participant asks, there are many great open source projects that lay dormant because few understand the technology to become volunteers. And another reason for these small heroic projects is a fragmentation in the area that it addresses. It goes on to include an example. Can POSE grants help bring these projects together for better resource sharing and momentum in the same capacity as organizations like the Linux Foundation? And so this brings up an interesting point that I did not mention during the presentation, but is a wonderful piece of advice for potential proposers. And that is to use NSF's public awards search as a way of finding out what POSE has funded before. So the kind of activity that's this participant asked about, where you would try to tie together the threads of different projects that really belong together in some important way. There are examples of that. I will say that sometimes it looks like it's going to be difficult to pull off because you have different projects with different owners, different expectations for governance and growth. And so it's not always easy to pull those things together, but it is a potential kind of project to consider. So again, take a look at the existing awards that POSE has made and try to think about how your idea would fit in the context of things that have already gone successfully through the merit review process. Next question. We have an internal piece of software that we want to open source and then use the POSE program to fund that process? Or do we need open source project before applying? So Peter comments that you should have an open source product before applying to either phase. And I think if you're earlier in that curve, it's possible that you could apply to phase one. I mentioned before that we don't demand that you have a license all set up at the time when you're applying to phase one. But you want to make sure in your project description that you make it clear to merit reviewers that there's momentum behind what you're trying to do to make this open source, right? If there's an indication that you're looking for POSE funding for something that will not be committed to being open source over a long period of time, that is probably going to raise some eyebrows. And certainly by the time you get to phase two, a lot of those things should really be sorted out because phase two should be working on creating the managing organization for an existing and mature open source project that already exists as a publicly available resource. So next participant asks, I've applied for America's Seed Fund. This might be another starting point for my project. Is it allowed to apply for both POSE and America's Seed Fund? And Peter points out that it's possible, but you can't receive funding from NSF for two things that are doing the same activity. So you can't double dip. And the other thing is, maybe Peter can comment on this on Mike. That is, if you're applying to America's Seed Fund, you might have a goal in mind of trying to commercialize your project, in which case it might not be eligible for POSE. Peter, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's true, Jeff. I agree. The aim in SBIR is to build technologies where the intention is to commercialize. Now, having said that, we do receive a lot of proposals in SBIR where companies opt for an open source model because it's commercially advantageous. So there is a sort of a blurry line there, but I think the more important point is if you're applying to SBIR, you're applying to build a technology, and that's not something that we fund in POSE. So they're kind of complementary objectives between the two programs. But in principle, you could build an open source technology using SBIR funds and then transition to POSE to build an open source ecosystem around that in principle.
Thank you, Peter. The next question is there preference for software that supports scientific research, or is it open-ended? It's definitely open-ended. And if you look at the previous awards, there are many that are, or at least several that are not from NSF lineage. So they're not what you would consider, piece of core scientific software. What user base qualifies an open source project as a good candidate for funding? And Trish says it depends on the product, and that's very true. So some projects could have a huge impact even with a small user base, and so if your future user base would never be more than 100 spectroscopic astronomers, if that's even a thing, then we wouldn't expect you to have thousands of people to start. So it is very much domain dependent. What you're trying to show, though, is the potential for broader impact. So one of NSF's two main evaluation criteria, and showing broader impact means thinking about the user base that you will have after a period of time and how your product is going to make a difference in society based on those users making use of it. Next question, are applications reviewed as they submitted, are they held until the deadline? And Trish says they are held. So we're expecting our deadline to be early-ish in September. September 5 is on the current solicitation. And so we will take those as a bunch when we get them and put them through the panels. How many projects will be funded? And it looks like asking concerning phase 1 and phase 2. And Trish says we can't answer that question. You can, however, again, look at that existing award search and give some thought to the kinds of awards that were funded in different areas and get a flavor for things that might be successful or might not be successful based on the history of previous awards. Next question, open source with no user base would not qualify. Is that correct? And Trish says that is correct. How many letters of support do you need for phase 1 funding? As I mentioned before, 5 is preferred, but 3 to 5 is what is shown in the solicitation. Next question. We have open source on GitHub and have been used by users and also by a large company. Is this appropriate for phase 2? It's not clear what the requirements are for phase 2. So the gray line between phase 1 and phase 2 depends on how ready you are to create and flesh out that managing organization. So if you're confident that you know what your user base looks like, who your developers are, you're ready to get those people involved and on board, you know where to go to develop those communities. Basically, your project is mature enough to be ready for a managing organization, then you should apply to phase 2. In office hours, in future meetings that I'll be doing later this spring, we can talk about that in more detail. And also, if you'd like to sketch out what you have in mind and ask that question again, you could send the question to pose@nsf.gov. So next question, who can write a collaboration letter? Could this be some person using the software? It could be a user, it could be a developer. It could be someone who's impacted by the project. So not necessarily even a direct user or developer, but somebody who knows that the project has a big influence on what happens in their space. What you want to be doing is choosing letter writers that are going to attest to the importance and potential broader impact of your project. And if you can get those people on board and they're involved and their letter makes it clear that they're interested and willing and being part of your communities, then that's going to be very convincing to our merit reviewers. Have there been projects funded that span interests of NSF and NIH? And I'm thinking maybe, Trish, you are too, of the open source bionic leg. Is that what you were thinking of, Trish? And I think that's a great example of a kind of biomedical project that may have indeed had NIH funding at one point, but they're turning it into open source and open source hardware specifications, clearly in most cases. And so that's a great example of something that sort of spans that gap. Next question, can phase 2 funding be used for the creation or distribution of developer kits? In the case of hardware projects, the goal would be to grow the user base and encourage contributions. So this is one of those gray areas again. Obviously, developer kits can be super helpful in getting additional developers on board, but it's probably not sustainable over the long term to depend on NSF to pay for those, and in order for the project to be sustainable over a period of time. And Trish also points out that the core development activities are not allowable under OPPOS awards. But there could be a role in initial ramp up of creating your developer communities, of having a limited number of kits that are used for sussing out what your developer community looks like, what it needs, how you're going to onboard future developers and so forth. It's just important to keep in mind that you need a sustainability plan, because NSF, I don't think, would be able to fund the distribution of developer kits over the long term. Next question. I understand the project should be based on open source. We're developing devices, and can we find the open source device and based on the project on it? I'm not sure I understand this question. If you'd like to repost and clarify, that would be great. If a device already exists and you're in an open source form, and there is the possibility that it could be developed to include future innovations, then it's potentially post-fundable. So feel free to post again to clarify what you were after. Can an open source project started by an organization that is not ours be a candidate for funding by our organization? Is there a conflict? Is there a potential conflict of interest there? Now, there are some interesting relationships among projects and nonprofits, and you don't have to go much further than some of the larger open source software foundations to find those interesting relationships. So there's nothing intrinsically wrong with this. What matters, though, is where the POSE funding is going to go, what it's going to be used for. And it has to be used for the activities that I showed on that one key slide that talks about where POSE funding goes. And another participant says, I asked this question last year. I'm wondering if any of the thinking has changed. Represent an academic organization that enables students to develop open source projects as part of their coursework. These can be faculty driven, externally driven, or student driven. Some projects are long-lived, 10 years or more. And I'd like to put together an organization that could support all of these projects in getting sustainability. Would a proposal advocating the formation of an office like this be responsive? If it's not based on a particular product, it probably is not going to fit well within the context of the POSE program. Most of the solicitation is written around the idea that you've got an open source project and what you need to do is build a managing organization around it. So it's not impossible to imagine a scenario like what you described. And there may be other places that NSF that could potentially fund it. There are some infrastructure programs, for example, that potentially could fund this. But it doesn't sound on the face of it like it's a good fit for POSE. Next question is similar in some ways. Does it have to be a specific open source project? Can we target a type of open source project instead of just one single project? I mentioned before that some people have successfully come up with ideas for weaving together multiple projects that really belong together because they are complementary to each other. So that's a possibility. But if you don't have a core project already built that could be used by users and developed by developers, it's not likely to be a good fit for POSE. Next question, if we've already submitted for POSE phase 1 and we're declined, is it encouraged to rework the proposal and resubmit? Yes, we're always welcome to resubmissions. And if you have any questions about what you might do to strengthen your proposal, you should feel free to write to that email address, pose@nsf.gov, and there may be a conversation that we can have that could be potentially helpful. Next question, are statements around licensing required phase 2? You definitely want to have your licensing in place at the time of phase 2. The solicitation is not explicit about this, to my recollection, but merit reviewers, as I've observed, are really concerned about this for phase 2. If there's not a clear indication that this project is going to be available under an open source license, that seems to bother merit reviewers. Next question, is it possible to apply for funding to support a training curriculum, workshop, internship, seminar to recruit new developers and have them gain experience by learning how to program using feature requests from actual users as real-world coding projects? So this sounds to me like it has a large educational component. So you might want to look carefully at some of the educational funding programs that NSF offers, because what you've outlined here sounds promising as a possibility for a method of having students learn open source techniques and developer techniques more generally. We have developed a technique that has been adopted by many large companies such as Google. One company has actually open sourced their implementation. We're currently planning to offer a more secure and robust version of the open source. Is this a good, is our case a good fit for Pose? And Trish answers that Pose does not fund development. So I think you want to think about the details that are involved here. If what you need to do is create a managing organization that's going to own and govern and administer and sustain this innovation, then Pose might be a possibility. But if really what you need is to be able to pay developers, then Pose is not going to be a good fit for that. Can one organization receive funding from 2 different tip solicitations that are funding different work? And Trish says, yes, you can't receive funding for a project that's already supported. Very true. Can Pose award be focused on a device rather than software? Yes, absolutely. And there's another question coming up about this as well. Let's see. Can Pose awards be focused on offering a more secure and robust version of a piece of open source? No, that would be considered core development activity in all likelihood. Next question, should the addressed device be available in open source? I mentioned before that there can be a little bit of a differential between phase 1 and phase 2. A project that is applying for phase 1 funding that hasn't quite figured out all the open source licensing, but is poised or has already made the specifications public, that could be eligible for phase 1. But all of that should be much more mature by the time you get to phase 2. Can an open source plugin that is part of a closed commercial product be a candidate for the funding? Trish says it might. And I would agree with that answer, definitely. If it's not something that can be adopted more widely for some kind of societal benefit, then it's unlikely to pass that broader impact merit review criterion. So you're going to have to give some careful thought to how you can make an argument for impact if your project is sort of somehow enclosed within a larger ecosystem that's not open. Can you speak more details on international collaborations? If we have colleagues also working abroad, would that make it not eligible for Pose funds? Now, Trish mentions that there are things that can be done with a sub-awards, and having international activities does not intrinsically make something unfundable by Pose or another NSF program. But note that NSF funding cannot generally be used to fund a foreign activity. So a foreign scientist or a foreign developer cannot generally receive NSF funding. Um, Okay, so this is a follow-up. Specification of only research staff means that our universities won't let other people be PI or senior personnel. And so Trish responds that non-research persons may be listed as senior personnel. And I just want to comment to this person and the larger group of participants that this is a message that we heard, and stay tuned for future details. That's probably about all I can say at this point. So if POSE funds the evolution of a open source product into an open source ecosystem, the new ecosystem may incur future maintenance. Are there other funding opportunities within NSF after POSE termination? And Trish says it depends on the activities that are requiring support. And there are many groups that have multiple irons in the fire, as it were, with NSF. I have heard merit reviewers comment that they're not excited about proposals where it looks like POSE funding is meant to just fill a gap of 1 or 2 years until some other grant funding can happen. And the takeaway from that, from my perspective, is that sustainability and an argument for sustainability is really crucial for a phase 2 award. You want to try to make the clearest case you can that at the end of 2 years, that you have other sources of funding cultivated, such as sponsorships or this marketing of educational opportunities, whatever it is that works. And there's some nice books out there on how to sustain an open source ecosystem. But whatever works appropriately for your project, that you've thought of that, and you've got plans in your phase 2 project for getting to that point of sustainability, rather than imagining POSE funding as something that just kind of closes the gap till your next possibility of grant funding. Next question, we have an open source application with an international user community and are seeking to grow our global reach, as well as potentially develop collaborations with tribal libraries and archives in the US and Canada. Do I understand correctly that POSE grant funded activities where we are compensating those collaborators for their contributions would be allowed under the guidelines of the POSE program? So Trish mentions, yes, if justified, international support can be requested as a sub-award. And then with respect to tribal nations, I would say that it would be important to consult the proposal guide that NSF publishes. There's a new proposal guide coming out that will be in effect starting in May. And that contains some very important new language about working with tribal nations. And so I would make sure to take a close look at that before formulating proposals that involve working with tribal nations. Can you clarify what constitutes a subaward? Again, there is information in the PAPG, as we call it, the proposal and award guide, that discusses what constitutes a subaward. The most important thing to remember is that in some large research projects, 2 entities both submit proposals that are linked, and we don't allow that in the POSE program. There has to be one primary proposer, and they can include in their budget an award to another institution, which is also named and gives a budget justification. But it's all, the award itself goes out to one institution only. So will it be posted on YouTube? I don't know if it will be hosted on YouTube or not, but it will be available on the POSE website as a link that you can follow. We're getting to the end here. We have an open source project that was initially developed with the support of NSF grants in the past. Is it eligible to be a targeted project for POSE? And Trish says, yes, and that's exactly right. And that's what we're encouraging too. So we love it when NSF lineage projects come along and are hoping to develop into a sustainable ecosystem. Although I will remind you that, as I mentioned earlier, that we do welcome projects, open source projects that come from other places other than NSF lineage as well. It's not a closed system. And so the final question that's in the list, can you provide examples of past awardees? So go to the award search, the NSF award search, which is easy to find online, and I'll give you a secret code that lets you focus in on POSE programs, POSE awards, and filter out all the other stuff. That secret code is 211Y, 211Y. And that's a program code that if you put it in the right box in the award search, will show you all of the POSE awards that we've made so far, and only those POSE awards that we've made so far. And if you go in there, you find an award that seems to be similar in its general outline to what you have in mind. That might be a promising way of seeing what is potentially fundable in the future by the POSE program. All right, so I'm gonna
Jen?
wait. Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, there are 4 open questions. Oh, now there's 7. There are open questions that I can't answer.
Okay. I got them. Yep. Can you discuss how to navigate the open source project being led by a small business or LLC who contributes to the open source project, i.e. such a thing expected for SBIR, but is it discouraged for POSE? So the answer is that we welcome proposals from for-profit organizations. So if there's a small business that's working on a product that is currently open source, or they're expecting to make it open source, then that organization is a perfectly good proposer. Clearly, the proposal needs to make it clear how the small business is going to maintain the POSE funded activity as an open source project into the future, but there's nothing intrinsically wrong with the scenario mentioned. For sharing of biological resources, there's a need for clarifying concerns around material transfer agreements and licensing terms specific to biology. Would activities that create guidelines be an appropriate POSE activity? It would be in service of a specific product, but also be useful for other open source bio-sharing projects. So POSE, as I mentioned in the presentation, is not limited to software. And so if you're talking about a resource where the resource can be put out into the world and people can innovate over it and reuse it and share it, then it fits that template of being a potentially fundable open source ecosystem. So of course, the details matter here. So, transfer agreements and licensing terms, if those are the core products that you're hoping to open source, it would have to be clear how there's an ongoing ecosystem of intellectual development to those products. That's probably a little bit more vague than what you'd like, but I would encourage you to write to pose@nsf.gov if that didn't make the result more clear. Our open source product is primarily serving low and middle income countries, but we want to build an ecosystem of companies, startups that adapt the project to US health system because it requires meaningful use. Activities will require some development, but certification from CMS. Is that a valid phase 2 activity? And it sure sounds like it has the potential to be a valid phase 2 activity. Clearly, if the impact of that activity is dependent upon CMS certification, then you would need to make a clear case in the proposal how that is going to happen and the appropriate time frame so that the ecosystem can develop around that project productively. There was a previous question on using a non-commercial license for an open source product. Non-commercial licenses are not recognized by either the free software community or by the open source initiative. Both require the potential for commercialization for users. What criteria we'll be using to determine if a proposed piece of software is licensed correctly. So that's not up to us, right? That merit reviewers are going to look at the arrangements that you have in mind, and they're going to pass judgment on what you've written. And that judgment may be positive or negative, depending upon how well you've made the case for those broader impacts. There's nothing in the solicitation proposed that says you have to use a particular kind of license. So you have to keep in mind the kinds of reviewers that I mentioned, some of whom are experts in open source, some of whom are experts in the topical domain, and imagine how they're going to react to the licensing arrangements that you mentioned, and then make your arguments about how that's the appropriate choice for your project. All right, what do you think, Trish? Is it all done? With
I
5
think we're
minutes to
done.
spare?
Oh, there's more.
There's a new one. You should never say that, Jeff.
So that one guy in the meeting that's got to extend it out to the very last minute.
All right, so we developed a distributed talent recognition protocol and want to build developer kits and open APIs to integrate the protocol into disparate management information systems. It would also enable new software applications for the data layer. So ask yourself, are you going to make it open source? Will other people be able to adopt it? Can you create a developer community where intellectual contributions will be coming in to innovate over the project? And is it going to have potential positive societal impact? If you can answer all those things in the positive, then it certainly has the potential to be a fundable POSE project. And so
Keeping in mind again that POSE does not fund development.
Yep. So more questions or clarifications about any of these things, remember that email address pose@nsf.gov, and we'll be happy to address further questions. And keep in mind that I'll be doing some office hours as we go through the spring and summer that will help proposers navigate all of the details of the solicitation. Short second question. Is there a group for folks who are asking questions for POSE join together to explore potential partnerships? We're not allowed to endorse a group like that, but I will tell you that out there, if you do the right kind of searching, there are a number of foundations that are concerned with making open source work better. And some of those foundations have things like monthly calls, they have Slack channels, they have ways of putting people in touch with one another. So I would search for open source support, development foundation, those kinds of search terms, see what you come up with, and then find out if there might be one of those organizations that you could join to get more information. All right, so we answered that one live, and that's done. I think we're done. 2 minutes left. Cool. Thanks, Trish and Peter, for being here, helping out. Much appreciated.
Oh, I just realized that I made myself part of an organization called POPSI. Sorry.
And what is that?
It's supposed to be POSE. I just hit the O a little too enthusiastically.
That could be a new solicitation.
Yeah, right. All right.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.